Lindsay, Ontario, like many small towns across Canada, grew during a time of industrialization and expansion in the province. Its heritage homes tell stories of a town shaped by industry, by commerce, and the people who lived and worked here. Housing wasn't just a place to live, but a symbol of status and power. Going back in time a little bit, in the late 1800s, Lindsay's population was approaching around 4,000 people. The town followed a very similar pattern seen across rural Ontario. And this pattern was that those who owned land and homes were often the same people who controlled the local economy and business. For many, owning a home wasn't just about shelter, it was about social mobility. Thomas Keenan was one of Lindsay's early and most wealthy citizens. Keenan moved to Lindsay in the early 1850s, where he became a prominent figure in the town's growth. He ran a general store at the corner north of the Post building on Lindsay Street and was instrumental in rebuilding Lindsay and its downtown landscape after the Great Fire, constructing brick buildings all along Kent Street. The Keenan blocks at the time in Lindsay were, and this is around 1860, were the largest and most imposing buildings. The rebuilding and expansion of this area following that fire of 1861 happened very quickly and resulted in a general uniform architectural style for its commercial blocks. And this style is more or less the Italianate style with other influences in it, and it was popular at the time, influenced nearly every commercial building, and its decorative details can still be seen throughout the area when you're walking along Kent Street. When looking at Kent Street in the 19th century, and even going into the middle of the 20th century, and I guess today, it shows the streetscape along Kent featuring a variety of architectural details appropriate to that predominant Italianate style. These included finials and sculptures on parapets and brick dentils along cornice lines. But back in the 1860s, Lindsay was just beginning to take shape from its early days when it was known as Purdy's Mill. The Lindsay Land Company played a big role in shaping Lindsay by subdividing the area. South of Rideout Street, most blocks were split into 4 lots on each side, facing north-south, and 2 lots each facing east-west. But Lindsay Street, on the other hand, was an exception. It had 6 lots, likely because it was one of those main roads going into the town. Between Kent Street East and Rideout Street, the blocks were divided into 6 smaller lots. Closer to the river, homes faced either Kent Street East or Water Street. These lots were noticeably smaller than others that are in town, and this unique layout in this part of Lindsay by the river stands out compared to other neighborhoods, such as along Kent Street or even in the Bond Street area. In the late 1850s, a key development helped bring the community of Lindsay together. One of the most important was the construction of St. Mary's Church, which was built between 1857 and 1859. The land for the church was granted back in 1854, 3 years prior, and over those 5 or 6 years, the church precinct grew. By 1874, a convent was added, and later, John Knowlson's house on Russell Street became the church rectory after the Knowlson family donated it to the church. After the fire destroyed Lindsay in 1861, it gave the wealthy a chance to really capture the market and expand their already large portfolio of assets. But this also changed the way building was constructed in this town.
Hi, my name is Emily Turner. I'm the Economic Development Officer for Heritage Planning with the City of Kawartha Lakes. Our communities have some differences in them, in some part because of their geography. So if you're looking at somewhere like Fenelon Falls and Bobcaygeon, for example, there are a lot of buildings there that were constructed with stone that was used from the Trent Canal. Not a lot of them are still standing, but there's some there, and it really links those communities, specifically the buildings, to the waterway, which is obviously really important in the development of those communities in the past. If you look at somewhere like Lindsay, you'll see a lot more brick, larger buildings, because it was always the regional center for the area. If we go north to somewhere like Cogeco, you'll see a lot more wooden buildings. There's a lot fewer brick buildings, particularly from the 19th century, because of the huge impact of the lumber industry there. So you'll see wood from the building, wood from the trees that were taken down as part of our lumbering in the past that were used to build buildings at Cogeco. So by looking at those different historic things, you can see it in some of the buildings throughout our communities. So in Ontario, we have criteria for designating heritage properties, and those criteria are given to us by the provincial government, and every municipality in Ontario has to follow them. So there's 9 criteria under something called Ontario Regulation 906, and a property has to fulfill 2 of them in order to be eligible for designation, and they fall under 3 main categories. So the first one is around its architecture. So we look to see if it has early, unique, representative, rare examples of certain style or type of architecture or building. We look and see if it has a high level of craftsmanship or artistic merit, or if it has specific scientific or technical achievement associated with it. The second group of criteria is around its historic value. So that's really what its role is in history and how important it is to the people who live there. So one of the criteria is whether or not it's related to an important person, theme, event, organization within a community. Another one of those criteria is if it yields information about the history of a community. And the last one is if it was designed by an important architect or builder who worked in the community. So not necessarily a famous architect, but somebody who was important to the community. The last 3 criteria are around its contextual value, so what its role is in the contemporary community and what that looks like. So the first of those 3 criteria are whether or not it contributes to the local streetscape. There is a criteria around whether or not it defines and supports the heritage character of an area. And the last is if it's a local landmark. So local landmarks are generally things like churches, schools, government buildings, not so much houses, but that's a criteria we often use for larger institutional buildings.
So by 1869, so we're going like about 5 years after the town really rebuilt itself, just 10% of the population controlled 75% of all land wealth and all land. And when you look specifically at the top percent, the mere 2% of individuals own more than 1/3 of all land in Lindsay. That 2% equates to just 15 men. What made Lindsay stand out was how closely tied land ownership was to the business ownership, which created a system where land was not just a piece and a place to live, but a tool for controlling that local economy and controlling commerce and really controlling the lives of the working class. Many of Lindsay's residents were of the working class. They worked long days and for, a very small wage to support their family. When looking at homes within the community of Lindsay, you can get a sense and an idea where these economic and social classes resided.
Often when you're looking at buildings in different areas of town, particularly in somewhere like Lindsay, which is a little bit larger, so it has bigger areas with larger numbers of buildings that you can compare to each other, you can see who lived in different areas by the size of the building, the size of the lots, the styles that they were constructed in. So for example, in Lindsay, the Bond Street area has a lot of very large houses in it, and a lot of the business and political elite of the late 19th century lived in that area and in the surrounding streets, and you can certainly see that in the kinds of architecture that's there. Whereas if you look at other areas of Lindsay, such as south of Kent Street or in the Pumpkin Hollow area, that's much more of a working class architecture that was constructed from about 1850 up to around 1930 or so, and you can see it in the smaller houses, the less ornate architectural styles, the smaller lots. So you can really learn a lot about who lived in an area just by the architecture that's there.
My name is Erica Baptiste, and I live in an old farmhouse here in Lindsay on St. David Street. The house has been renovated over the years by previous owners, but we have found that we still have the old well next to the house, and down in the basement we have what we believe is an old root cellar still. We haven't been able to find too much, but we'd love to find more. Our front porch has 1945 grained into it, so we think that's when the old footpath was made and where the old front door would have stood, and just it must have had a different entryway than what we're used to.
In this area in Lindsay, one can easily see its working class roots. By the 1890s, the community was coined Pumpkin Hollow due to the fact that there was large pumpkin patches grown in the area. Looking at when these homes were built, there were, in the Pumpkin Hollow area, 68 homes were constructed in the 1870s, and then when you're looking at other decades compared to the 1860s, there were 20 homes constructed, and then in the 1880s, you had 24 homes constructed. So in that 70s, right after that fire, Lindsay started really growing their economic working class base. The Catholic Church played a large role really in shaping where the rich and the poor lived within the Pumpkin Hollow community. Wealthier residents lived to the west of the church, and those of the town's working population who went to work every morning and worked those 12-hour days lived to the east of the church and closer and nearer to the river, whether it's on the north side or on the east side. The Pumpkin Hollow area continued to be associated with the Catholic Church, which held a prominent place within this area, as well as the Needler and Sadler mills. The grist mill that was constructed by William Needler and his father in 1869 was one of the larger and largest employers in the town, and possibly the largest until the Sylvester manufacturing was established later in the 1870s and 80s. In fact, after the Flavels became associated with the milling interests in 1884, both William and J.D. Flavel, they were brothers, were the largest employers throughout Lindsay between all of their three businesses, whether you're looking at the mill, the creamery, or the cold storage and dry goods store. So right here we have J.D. Flavel, and around him you have the staff of the Flavel Milling Company, or most likely the Sadler, Dundas, and Flamel Milling Company. And just clearly based on attire, you know exactly which class all the workers belong to, compared to JD here, who's wearing a nice white or tan suit, compared to everyone else wearing their working clothes. When looking at the architectural style around this area, and specifically around the old mill, you'll see more of a vernacular style to each of the homes. And this covers different architectural designs as well as influences to create that utilitarian purpose-built home for workers around the area. The majority of the buildings and the homes in the Pumpkin Hollow area are what could be classified as workers' housing. They were small residential properties, 1 to 2 stories in height, with very limited decorative features. These buildings were highly utilitarian, although they often did integrate features more common in the defined stylistic types of architecture found throughout Lindsay. And the most popular workers' housing can be seen in the gable front vernacular. The reason for these homes being situated close to their work if they worked at the mill was to shorten that length that they had to take to walk to work, and keeping in mind that these homes were much smaller, which also meant cheaper rent. Even within the working class, home ownership was still very precarious. Those with higher paying jobs or stable employment could enter the housing market, while others were left to rent in perpetuity, facing an uphill battle to even own property, whether it be in their 40s or 50s. Not everyone would be stuck in a cycle of working hard labor, jobs, and renting. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps is a phrase that everyone knows. And there was that possibility of mobility upwards to that higher class. And looking at specific citizens, you have Thomas Stewart, and he was able to move out of his rented property that he had on Queen Street and Francis Street after he graduated from law school. Though he was already privileged enough to attend law school in the first place, Thomas was able to, article with his mentor, Duncan J. McIntyre, and after entering into partnership with him, he moved him and his wife into a nicer Victorian-style home on the corner of Francis Street. The Stewarts, both Thomas and Lillian, enjoyed a growing family over the years and were finally able to purchase a home at 70 Bond Street, finally becoming part of the economic and social class that most would desire. So here we have a letter sent by Judge Duncan J. McIntyre to Lillian Stewart upon the death of Thomas Stewart. And Thomas Stewart was able to buy property, but it's okay and fun to note that, sometimes privilege does help, and McIntyre was a wealthy citizen here in Lindsay. And in it, he tells Lillian stories that she never knew and that Thomas kept hidden from her. And one particular one was the fact that Duncan McIntyre gave Thomas Stewart money for the first property that he bought. McIntyre writes that he, Thomas Stewart, purchased the first property he had acquired at my suggestion. I told him to buy it as I knew it would go cheap. He said he had no money. I said all you will require in cash will be the deposit and that you could take out of the current account, meaning the McIntyre and Stewart law firm. I'll arrange the rest and it will be done in that way. And the balance was borrowed on mortgages. I saw arranging my old papers, one signed by him, to indemnify me for guaranteeing the mortgage. If you've ever been to Lindsay and drove down Bond Street, you would notice the larger homes, especially on the north side of the street. Manicured lawns, large, nice red brick, maybe white brick, and it really showed the class of who lived there. Starting east of Victoria Avenue on Bond Street, you start to see these imposing homes, presumably built in the 1850, generally Victorian or neoclassical classical style of architecture.
So I was actually born here. My parents bought this home in 1983. And I grew up here and then moved away and started a family and started my career. And then 2 years ago, we moved back with my two daughters and my wife and took over the home from my parents. So we've owned it now for 2 years. So my dad was an actuary in Toronto, and he had a client here who owned a box factory and was putting it up for sale. And my dad thought, why not? and so ended up buying the box factory here in town and moving our family up here, and that's the sort of history. Yeah, so it's a Georgian architectural home. Typically, the Georgian style homes were fairly simple with little details here and there to kind of drive. What's different about this Georgian style home is that they did integrate a lot of Victorian elements. So when you're on the inside of the home, there's lots of the plaster medallions and large crown molding and large moldings around the windows, doors, baseboards. That isn't exactly typical of Georgian homes. So they took a bit of liberty with the original type of architecture, but the home itself is Georgian in that both sides of the home mirror one another. In this particular home too, they had the back side of the home was set up for a servants area, so there's some interesting features that were done back there as well to kind of that were a little bit less typical of a Georgian home. So the house or the property was originally gifted to a doctor to entice him to come and set up his practice here in the Kawartha Lakes, and he chose instead to set up in Woodville. And then sold the home, or the property I should say, to Silas Bigelow. Silas ended up building this house along with two others on Bond Street for his children, and then his children lived here and passed it down through family a couple times before eventually it was sold off to Lady Eaton's cousin, and at that point the house kind of took on a bit more of a historical element. Yeah, so I mean, the story goes that Lady Eaton and her cousin was the one who lived here permanently, but Lady Eaton would come and stay here on occasion, and they have identical bedrooms upstairs across the hall from one another, and the story goes that they would holler at each other, and they would be in their own beds, but talking to one another across the hall. They also had dueling servants doorbells in their rooms that they would ring and get the servants to come up and bring them food.
When we make our way up the street, you'll see another heritage home on Bond Street, and that is number 40. And it was constructed around 1870, and it is an excellent example, and rare example for that matter, in Lindsay of a buff brick Victorian style home. It integrates elements that were popular in a number of different styles during the period of the 1870s, including its decorative hood molds, drop, finial, and bay windows. And it also retains that classical veranda, likely added around the turn of the century, probably in the 1905 area.
I'm Marion Para, and this is my husband.
And I'm Terry Para.
And we've lived in here for this will be 21st year.
Yeah.
We'd always noticed this house walking around town, and I always loved it. And I always knew that it, had a bit of a history to it. And it was interesting to me in terms of who had lived here before, because there was a teacher who lived here, Mr. Glennie from LCBI, and his family had lived here for over 40 years. So when we moved in, he had moved out already. Another family had had it for about 6 years, I believe.
Yeah.
And in between, they had done a lot of the wiring, that kind of thing that needed to be to bring it up to standard, which was awesome because we didn't have to do that. We had done that in previous old homes and just didn't want to get into all of that again. So it was, we came in, we just loved it immediately, and there wasn't a whole lot we had to do to it, and just appreciated, the openness of it really, because a lot of old homes are very sort of cut up small rooms, little sort of hallways that lead nowhere, lots of little doors. It's very open, this home, so it's, big rooms, but it still feels comfortable, and warm.
Well, what I really like are the rounded windows that we have upstairs. Upstairs in the master bedroom, there's beautiful rounded windows that you don't see too often, and the brickwork around the windows is nice. Then we have 4 chimneys, and And I don't know what some of them are for because there's nothing connected to them. So at one point, someone's covered up something or other. But the chimneys are beautiful, although they take a lot of work to keep going because you have to get them pointed up. But that's it. That's a beautiful
And the porch.
Oh, the
I love
porch.
the porch.
We sit on that porch all the time. Big wraparound porch, huge, and it's always got a nice little breeze to it. So.
Though there was something about the staircase. Well, I know one thing, that the people that were in here before us removed a wall in the entrance off the front porch. They had put a door and a closet in there, and it actually buried the little beautiful little window that's in our little front entryway now. So they got rid of that. So now the door is where it should be, and now there's an open area and the window's exposed. So I think there was a bit of that, just over the years, things would be built over certain features. And even the staircase, apparently there was some kind of a wall that went across there that they had to remove, and now that beautiful staircase is actually exposed, that you can enjoy it, right? So yeah, over the years, I think people just do things.
One of the things we did was we stripped a bunch of wallpaper, and it was 40 or 50 years old, and it was a lot of work, but we did it. But when we stripped it all, we found doorways that had been completely covered over. So that was like, where's that doorway going? That doesn't work. But I guess at one time it worked in this house, but it's been redone over. So.
The housing patterns established in the late 1800s in Lindsay really laid the foundation for much of the town's development throughout the years. The stories behind the architecture always lie around social class and the folks who once lived there. And it's one that shapes the lives of the town's residents, but also continues to influence the housing dynamic to this day.